Okay. So everybody grab one of these. And I'm not kidding, they're very small. Did you grab one? So it's very small. There's really not a lot of fun here. And what happened was this. I got it off this amazing website and I quick printed it because it was so good. And then it disappeared. And so I couldn't copy it to convert it to text. I tried to convert this, but the print was just kind of shaky. It gave me gobbledygook. Yes or no? You hear it? For sure. And it gives great information about the decision to drop the atomic bomb. And as luck would have it, that's going to be your DBQ on Tuesday. The decision to drop the atomic bomb. So, when you read this, some of you, so I'm going to collect this again when we're done so I can use it again because that's a lot of paper. But put this in the margin of the first page if it's not already there. These are things you have to know and think about. You like jot down in your own notes so you're ready for the DBQ. The fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. What U.S. submarines were doing to Japan. The firebombing of Japanese cities. Tokyo is the best example. Yalta. It's a meeting of the big three and what decisions were made there. The Soviets in Japan. No, write it down on here. Write it down in the margin on there. That's why I said write it down on the margin. Soviets, and especially what the Soviets, the fear of the Soviets and Japan, and unconditional surrender. So jot that down so it's there, and you can jot down a few notes. It really gives you good material. I'll add a little bit more, but you have good material for the DBQ. Did someone have their hand up in here? Okay, I'll come around. There's not enough cheese in this one.
No, I'm not there. I'm not gonna. He's always like.
All right. So then we got it really will help you, and it's not very long. It really isn't that long. And so when we're done with the DBQ, I'll just collect it over the next couple of days so I can use it again. I know you're whining. Oh, who was gone yesterday? So I gave one more gift for everybody yesterday. This one, though, I very carefully hid. So I made a study guide. It's not an assignment. That's the study guide. I'm empty. That's my home. And you'll notice there's staple on the side. So just go through all the material just on your own. It's not an assignment. Yes. I made this while you guys were doing the ACT test. Yalta. Y-A-L-T-A. Yalta.
I just saw that last day.
All right. Let us begin then. Did we finish on? Did we get here? I told you about the code breaking the declaration of war and it became late on infuriating the Americans. So, what area, what colony did the Japanese want to get oil? Yeah, Dutch East Indies. And what did the United States? The United States embargoed oil after the Japanese took what French colony? What French colony led to the oil embargo? Yeah, Indochina, which is today, what country? What countries? What is the big one we need to know? Vietnam, yeah. Yeah, and there were nationalist communist guerrillas there that the U.S. would help fight the Japanese in Vietnam. Their leader was a guy named Ho Chi Minh. That will have some impact. We'll have in about a week. So here's Pearl Harbor. Oh, what was the turning point battle? The turning point, the second turning point in Europe, Moscow, and what's the city? Yeah, Stalingrad. And what else? Oh,
when the Germans realized they were not going to win the war the way they thought they did, they were going to. Hitler turned the war into a fight against a what? The Jewish what? Well, they called it the Jewish question, but there was a massive Jewish what? You remember?
Conspiracy.
Yeah, conspiracy. A massive Jewish conspiracy. And it was, therefore, the final solution to the what? That's really the Jewish question. About half death camps, and those in the Soviets, what would happen to them? Soviet country, the areas of the Soviet Union, the Germans took. What happened to the Jews? Almost all shot. So, we got this declaration of war. We got this, right? So, they did take the Americans totally by surprise. 4 battleships. That is BB means battleship. 4 American battleships were sunk. 2 of them, though, would be brought up from the bottom of the harbor, and they would fight again in 44. Yeah, they would fight at the biggest battle in naval history, the Battle of Lake Gulf. 2 of them were totally sunk, and that's one of them being sunk right there. The Arizona. The Arizona would turtle. Meaning it would turtle over 1,000 sailors would die on board. That today is a memorial. It is still leaking oil, and it is still a tomb for 1,000 sailors. How do you get them out? The armor on the bottom of the ship is thick. Couldn't say. And so, the Japanese attacked airfields, destroyed most of the U.S. planes on the ground, took Americans totally by surprise, sunk other ships. It was a disastrous battle. Remember, the Japanese plan attacked the American fleet, attacked the American naval base and air bases on a U.S. colony, and what would the U.S. do? Just quit, drop out, get out. That's the plan. But this did the exact opposite. The United States, which was disunified about the war, are now unified together. And the Japanese made a series of fatal blunders here. They missed U.S. aircraft carriers. There were 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific, and all 3 just happened to be out of harbor. So bad luck for the Japanese, great luck for the Americans. One was sailing into Pearl Harbor that day, but the Japanese, shocked at their victory, had already pulled away. And that could have been decisive. And you know what a dry dock is to repair ships? Pearl Harbor had massive dry docks, big enough for battleships and aircraft carriers. They didn't destroy them. If they would have destroyed them, any major ship that had to be repaired had to go all the way to San Diego or San Francisco, adding months to the repair. These 2 things would be war-winning mistakes, war-winning or war-losing mistakes by the Japanese. So, Pearl Harbor. It was, though, a devastating attack. Over 2,000 sailors, Marines, and soldiers died. There were a few civilian casualties too, but the Japanese were not targeting civilians at all on this colony. So this led to, and why do this to me? So Roosevelt, and this he would make one of his more famous statements. I'll just play the very beginning of it. There's a transcript from my recording, and I said gobbledygook, and they tried to spell gobbledygook in the transcript. Gobbledygook. Okay, gobbledygook.
Real world now.
Play. So He asked the United States Congress for war, and it was a unanimous Senate, and all but one member of the House voted for a declaration of war. And the United States, get this for the declaration of war, the United States was totally unified by this. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor unified the United States, unlike World War I, or for that matter, the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, Korea and Vietnam, totally unified. The one member was the same person who voted against World War I, too. She voted twice. Do you remember who that person was? Who? Remember? Anybody remember her? Jeanette Rankin. You remember Jeanette Rankin? Rankin voted against World War I. She was not alone there, but she lost for re-election in 1918 in the kind of the war fever. She was re-elected in 1940 to her old seat because of fear that the U.S. would get involved in another war. Now, she knew that, of course, the vote was going to pass. She was not like somehow stopping the U.S. war effort. So she decided to make a vote, even though she knew we had no choice but to go to war. But she was a pacifist and she stuck to her beliefs. And she knew there was going to be a declaration. This was, she was not even close to the deciding vote, obviously. What was it, 430 to 1? She would lose for re-election in 42. And so Jeanette Rankin will be, the first woman ever elected to the United States House of Representatives from Montana, and both wars twice because she refused to back down from her principles. And in the 1960s, she would be a vocal opponent to the U.S. involvement in the Civil War in South Vietnam. And so she's a pretty amazing person. She was a progressive Republican. And so back to this. Germany losing in front of Moscow. Hitler declared war on the United States. December, how did I get to here? Declared war on the United States. And that's the last fatal mistake. Hitler was totally delusional by then, misunderstanding America before Pearl Harbor and after, assuming that somehow this would make it harder for Britain and the Soviet Union to fight. The U.S. had a small army, but had the greatest industrial might in the world. And that would be decisive in this war. There's Hitler asking for the declaration of war right there in the Berlin Opera House, where they had the Reichstag. And Italy soon joined in the declaration of war. If Germany wouldn't have declared war, it's almost impossible to imagine Congress asking for a declaration of war against Germany. At least not for another year. And that would have been very divisive. And people would have said, logically, one war at a time. And if Japan, if they just would have went to the Dutch East Indies and attacked, and didn't attack the US or Britain, it's really hard to imagine the United States declaring war on Japan for that. Can you imagine the United States fighting for the Dutch government in exile to hold their colony in the Dutch East Indies? Could you imagine the U.S. declaring war for that? The Japanese made a horrific blunder doing that. The United States might have got involved in the war, but it would have been a year or two down the road, and it would have been much more divisive. So, terrible mistakes. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt and Churchill had met off of Newfoundland. And in private, Roosevelt made it clear, if the U.S. gets involved in a two-front war, Europe and Asia, two-front war, the United States would commit the bulk of their resources to defeat Germany first. Originally, the plan was 85% of American resources. It would turn out to be about 75%. It also gives you the idea of the number of resources the Americans have. Kind of monumental. And that would be, as Roosevelt would call, the arsenal of democracy. Yeah.
I've seen some things saying that Hitler was against the actions that Japan and England went along with it anyways. Is that true? Or was
Well, he wanted the Japanese to attack the Soviets.
But they
They went after the Dutch East Indies. So, Japan for the next 6 months had an amazing round of success. On December 10th, they attacked the American colony in the Philippines. The U.S. commander was Douglas MacArthur, the same guy who led the attack on the bonus island, remember back in 32. He had been discredited, but he was brought back into favor because we needed somebody there. And the plan was for the some 30,000 American troops and they got about 50,000 Filipino militia. They would retreat to Bataan, this little peninsula right here, and hold out until American reinforcements can arrive. The problem was there'd never be American reinforcements. They couldn't come after Pearl Harbor. So these men, there's MacArthur, that's them fighting in Bataan, they held out against overwhelming Japanese assault for all the way through until May, actually the end of April into May of 1942, but they were finally overwhelmed. Roosevelt would order MacArthur to go back to Australia. They flew him out, and he would help lead the counterattack, and would become one of the most famous American generals in history. I would say vastly overrated, but one of the most famous. But after this, an atrocity will happen that you need to know. It's called the Bataan Death March. Nearly 80,000 surrendered to the Japanese. They forced marched 76,000, about 60 miles, about 70 miles north, to a prison camp from Bataan. And in the process, a third of them would die, most of them murdered, sometimes brutally by the Japanese. They used them as bayonet practice. Here are American and Filipino forces using makeshift stretchers to try to get wounded men north. A third of them would be killed. Here's the Japanese gathering up American and Filipino prisoners. When these camps would be liberated in early 1945, those are the emaciated American prisoners. Thousands would die in the POW camps. What was the Japanese term for the code of the samurai? Bushido. Remember, the greatest dishonor, surrender. And so they excuse this, that those men who surrendered didn't deserve to be treated well. And over 100 Japanese officers would be executed for war crimes by the victorious Allies, many of them for the Bataan Death March. But they did the same thing to POWs they captured in British, Indian, Australian, they captured in Singapore, or in the Netherlands, or in Burma, and the horrors are what they did to Chinese prisoners. Winners get to decide war crimes. And on August 7th, 1945, Harry Truman made a radio address. He was justifying doing something. What was he justifying? Dropping the first atomic bomb. And what he said was, as one of the reasons, was the treatment of U.S. prisoners at Bataan. Did everyone catch that? The treatment of prisoners. Meaning, that would not only be a justification, but revenge. And this is after Japan had already been decisively defeated. They just wouldn't surrender yet the way we wanted. So, by June of 45, let's say 45, 41, the Japanese had this area under control. This was on your map. So, threatening British India, threatening British Australia, and holding islands. The plan was for the Japanese, we hold these islands, it'd be really difficult for any counterattack, because they'd have to go through these bases with the Japanese Air Force. But the US didn't sue for peace. And so, to put more pressure on them, first on Britain, their plan was to take the capital of Papua New Guinea, Port Moresby. And they were going to have an operation, naval operation, to take it. Overland, the jungle was just too thick. By Navy. US code breakers got word of that. And they sent 2 of our 4 remaining aircraft carriers. Japanese still had 6 large carriers to stop them. And it's going to be the Battle of Coral Sea, May of 42. And it would be kind of a draw, but the Japanese did not take Port Moresby. It's the first naval battle where the enemy combatants did not see each other. The battle's right here. It was all done by plane, showing how decisive aircraft carriers were. And the Japanese actually had one light carrier sunk. The two fleet big carriers, they lost so many planes they couldn't fight in the next battle. But the Americans, of those two carriers, one would be sunk. And the other, oh, I know you're saying, but I don't understand the battle. I thought he'd give a pretty easy to follow charting of the battle. This pretty much sums it up. You know what happened now, right? Naval maps are always confusing, but maps with aircraft carriers are really confusing because carriers have to turn into wind whenever they launch planes and then have to zigzag, so they just zigzag. So it's even more confusing. The aircraft carrier, the Yorktown, there's a reason for this story. The Yorktown was severely damaged, torpedo and a bomb. That's a bomb through its flight deck. Look at the explosion of it hit at Coral Sea, taken from another US ship. And look at the list. They had to drag this back, tow it just a few knots, and get it to Pearl Harbor. Remember Pearl Harbor? If they didn't have the dry dock, it would have had to go all the way to San Diego. Would have taken months. In peacetime, this kind of damage would have taken a year to fix, if not longer. And they're thinking, best case scenario, 8 months. Japanese thought it was sunk. Admiral Nimitz, the commander of the US Navy in the Pacific, ordered every man who could carry a wrench to be waiting on those dry docks that the Japanese did not destroy. And they pulled it in there, released the water, and just swarmed it. And it was ready to fight in 48 hours. It was still leaking fuel. There were still almost 500 civilian workers on board the Yorktown as it sailed out to fight because they needed to keep the engine going. But they got it ready to fight. I should add, you notice the deck? It's made out of teak, wood. That might seem to be like a problem and it does fire, etc. But you could just replace it by patching it with wood. So all the American carriers had wood decks in World War II. So we're leading to the big battle, the most important naval battle of World War II for the Americans, the Battle of Midway. So this is the Japanese plan. They're going to try one more time, one more big battle. And they did a diversion. They took 2 islands in the Aleutians. Remember, Alaska is an American colony they bought from Russia back in 1867. But the main attack would threaten Midway Island. Midway Island was basically just a sand dune that the U.S. had put a base and they had an airfield on it. Threaten this. It's 1,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. The U.S., Nimitz, would order his ships out, and the Japanese carriers, 4 of them, would ambush them, destroy them, and the Americans would sue for peace. But remember American code breakers. They had broken the code, and the Americans rolled the die. They sent their last 3 aircraft carriers, including the Yorktown, which the Japanese thought was sunk and by all rights shouldn't have fought. This is an all or nothing battle. So the Japanese attacked Midway Island, bombed the base, and they expected the Americans to come out, and the Americans ambushed them. They weren't ready. I can't go through all the details of the battle. We don't have time. But by a series of bad luck for the Japanese, incredible luck for the Americans. American dive bombers, called Goths, right here. Not great planes, but that's what we had. They surprised the Japanese aircraft carriers when their defense, their fighter planes, were off chasing other planes and sunk all 4 Japanese carriers. All 4 carriers. And that Japan never could recover. The Americans did lose 1 aircraft carrier. You know what carrier, I mean? That'd be the Yorktown. The Yorktown did not survive this battle. It would be sunk. But they would make another battleship or another aircraft carrier. So we started making carriers during the war, and they named it the Yorktown. And the Yorktown today, that second one, is a museum in Charleston Bay, South Carolina. You go to Charleston, there's this massive aircraft carrier there. It's pretty amazing. It fought all the way across the Pacific. And that be the turning point of the war. Japan could not recover. Oh, I know you're saying, let's get the map of this. Sum of the battle. Green, that's land-based planes for Midway. Isn't that amazing? So you got the battle. I should have just showed you that. U.S. industrial might would overwhelm the Japanese. Japanese were industrial power, but they just did not have the amount. I'm going to give you one example of American industrial might compared to the Japanese, because they're stretched so thin. The most important weapon, therefore, in the Pacific would be aircraft carriers. Look how many aircraft carriers the Americans could make. 24 large fleet carriers, which each could carry 90 planes. 8 light carriers that could carry about 40 planes. And then escort carriers were basically, they took a freighter ship and just stuck a flat top on it to escort planes, carried about 20 planes. Look at all the Japanese could make for the rest of the world. Because the resources were stretched so thin. That's just one example of the might. It also showed, therefore, the screw up at Pearl Harbor about not getting the carriers of the Japanese. So many strategic and tactical blunders. Yeah.
So how's our Navy looking at?
Looks like ships, they sail. Well, we still have by far the most powerful Navy in the world.
So like, how much do we produce?
Oh, we're not even close. You know, we have 11 super carriers now. And how many battleships do we have? Yeah, none. Battleships are obsolete. Good answer. And China has more ships, but most of their ships are not even in comparison. Yeah, the U.S. has still an incredibly powerful Navy. There are some flaws. We made this ship called the Littoral ship that was a $1 billion disaster. We're going to junk them all. So we got some problems. Some companies made a lot of money selling those. Yeah.
Were all these ships during the rest of World War II?
Yeah, all the rest of World War II. That's what we would produce. Those 24 carriers would be made after Midway. It's kind of amazing. So the Americans are going to have to start counterattacking. But remember all of these islands. They're going to start here at a hellacious battle called Guadalcanal and slowly advance over years. And the Japanese plan, hold out for peace terms, aka conditions, and win at attrition. So their plan would be to hold these islands and take as many Americans with them. Kill, maim so many American soldiers that the U.S. would eventually just super peace. So the Japanese could get some kind of peace terms that they could say they didn't lose. That's their plan. Has everyone got that? That's their plan. To make the war so horrible. And we're not going to go through all the fighting on these islands, but it's going to be hell. Because the Japanese will fight to the death. Remember, Bushido. We're going to talk about a couple and you read about them. The two, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Those are the ones we have to know. And there are others. I hate giving, skip over, but we don't have time. So the United States had to mobilize for war. Remember total war. Here, the entire nation towards war. And this time they did much better in World War II. This is the organizational chart of the War Department for munitions, with the president on top. It sums it up. I think you could reproduce this for the test, don't you think? So my favorite part about this is they made this chart to simplify it. Whoever made it thought this will make things so much easier. We'll know what everyone's responsible to. I have no idea what this is about, but I found this and I just said, I got to show you this. But they did a great job. But one of the first big problems, overnight, there's going to be a shortage of consumer goods. A shortage of consumer goods. Got this? A shortage of consumer goods. And these are massive shortages. There's already been a shortage because of the Great Depression. The economy was coming out of the Depression, and now they're no longer producing certain goods because either they need it for the war or they can't get it. Like chocolate is going to be really hard to get. Or for that matter, rubber. And so prices will go up. And so inflation is going to be a real problem. But the United States is going to deal with this better than any other war and better than most countries did. kind of copied what the British did, but did it better in a lot of ways. So all these things like rubber, rope, canvas are going to be much harder to get. This is giving you an example of women's clothing and what but men's clothing with the same thing. Because of the shortage of material, clothing are going to have to change, or how to alter existing clothes and to preserve material. And prices are going to skyrocket. But the United States, very experienced now with the New Deal, are going to create the Office of Price Administration, the OPA. And they're going to put strict controls on wages and prices to keep inflation down. And then, for products that people will need and bid the prices up, they put rationing. So they ration goods to make sure that not too much would be sold. And they did rationing through, you get a ration book and you get stamps. So you'd have stamps for certain types of meat, because it's going to be more rare. Milk. A big one would be like chocolate and oil, gasoline, rubber tires. And you had to have a certain number of stamps to buy these. I should add, we had plenty of gasoline, but we didn't have rubber. And so you ration gasoline, you don't drive as much, you don't need many tires. But there's still going to be a black market where people illegally sold goods around these rations. And if you had a little bit of money, you could buy stuff. And they called that Mr. Black. And that meant avoiding the ration. You have a question?
Yeah, because of the shortage of rubber, did they try making a synthetic rubber?
Yeah.
It also created the silly putty.
Not just silly putty, but plastics. Yeah, so that's where plastics are already being used, but yeah, plastics, yeah. Plastics. And a bunch of other things. Eventually, this is going to come, all kinds of interesting things for the planet. But that's another story for down the road. Oh, where do plastics come from? Petroleum. And so they dealt with inflation much better. But after the war, there's going to be huge pressure on prices. And I should add, because of the war and the Depression, they didn't make any houses. There's going to be an unprecedented shortage of houses after the war. Also, a significant number of women enter the workplace just like every other war. But remember, this is a war much of industrial might, the home front and producing goods. That's why total war is such a big deal. Producing factories, and no one could touch American factories, so they could produce. But men went off to war, women, which made up about 20% of the workforce before the war began, would more than double. And women started taking jobs that women were never allowed to take, and especially supervisory roles. And so I like this, do the job he left behind, and making artillery rounds, which is really dangerous work. So many women enter the workplace that it would radically shift the way people viewed that work down the road. My grandma, my mom's mom, started working in a bombing factory. She built, outside of Omaha, she built B-25 bombers, and then they started building B-24 bombers, and then B-29 Superfortresses. So I would argue my grandma won the war. You agree? You're cool with that? No, that's what I say. She would tell me stories about this when I was a kid, and I loved it. It was one of my favorite memories of her, looking back. But how proud she was. That was really cool. She was so proud of what she did. The other thing she remembers too is you couldn't get butter. Butter was rationed. You needed the oil to make munitions. Margarine would come about. Yeah.
One of those B-29s still running in last summer.
Yeah, we saw it. That was really cool.
My buddy's bought a plane ticket.
Oh, he did? I bet that cost about $500. I believe it. I wanted to do that before, my wife won't let me. She says they're too dangerous. I know this is weird to think about, but she likes me. But moving on. That's where you get the nickname Rosie the River. Rosie the River. And that would be the term for all these women into the workplace. It came from that great cover of the Saturday Evening Post, the famous artist of the mid-century, Norman Rockwell. I really liked that one. But then Westinghouse did a poster, and it didn't have a riveter, but this was actually for their own company. But this became even more famous. I have it right there. Most of you have probably seen this. I actually like this one better. I don't know why. That one's just really cool. The thing is, riveting was a really hard thing to do, to connect two pieces of steel. And it took too long to train. So most women who did this kind of job actually welded. Welding was easier than they were starting to make much better methods of welding during the war. They turned out to be eventually stronger than riveting. But for some reason, they went Rosie the Riveter. Not, I was not Wanda the Welder, but nope, we're going with Rosie the Riveter. What the heck, right? After the war ended, what happened to almost all of the women the day the war ended? Pig slips. They're all laid off. Every one. Most of them were happy. They wanted to get back to normal. And what was normal? The cult of domesticity, they thought. But this would become important in the 1960s as women growing up in that era, young adults and older, were looking back and demanding equal rights for women. And one of the arguments were that women couldn't do these jobs. And they looked back and said, what are you talking about? And they looked back at World War II. And that would become an important symbol for women's rights in the 60s. I find that just, I like how that's all tied together. But the cult of domesticity, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. So with that, Dr. Seuss. Here's a Dr. Seuss cartoon. This is before he was hired by the War Department for propaganda. A fifth columnist was another term for a spy. And it says honorable fifth column. And it's talking about the Japanese American immigrants and citizens of Japanese descent in California, Oregon, and Washington. And look at the horrible caricatures that Dr. Seuss drew for us. Racist caricatures of Japanese Americans. And they're picking up TNT to go do sabotage. This was done a month and a half after Pearl Harbor. I still like Dr. Seuss, but life is complex. And this would be part of the argument. All these Japanese American immigrants, most of them citizens, can they be trusted because they're Japanese? And that's going to lead to Japanese internment. California politicians begged Roosevelt to make basically the West Coast exclusion zone. And Roosevelt would issue, as part of his war-making powers, Executive Order 9066, forcing Japanese Americans, 120,000, to be interned in concentration camps. And they lost everything. And I should add, many of these California politicians, back then California was a very Republican state, but Democrat politicians did the same thing. They looked at the Japanese as competitors. They had very successful farms and businesses, and they lost everything. They lost everything when they were forced to go to concentration camps. And they set up assembly centers and then took the trains and sent them westward. Here are, so a store announcing they're closing and trying to say it's going to take, they're going to lose everything. And here, this is after Pearl Harbor, Japanese-owned grocery store saying we are an American, but it also shows that they just had to sell it because they knew no one was going to shop there. They lost everything, and they were going to be forced westward. That's a little girl waiting at an assembly center. Those are all the bags going to westward. There was a big concentration camp in Wyoming that did that. There was lined up to march in. You see the camp behind? That's Wyoming. Those camps look frighteningly familiar. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think you know. This is why total war is so horrible. No, this is not the equivalent of what Germany is going to do in the territories they occupied in Poland or Russia. But it's a big step towards it. And it shows the danger of total war and this type of irrational fear. And Roosevelt did sign that order. And that's one of the things. Every president, including presidents I admire, presidents I don't like, do good and bad things. Nobody is a saint. People made horrific mistakes and also did good. We can't go back and change that. We have to use that as lessons for today. Pick the good things, and then I would argue condemn the bad ones. Korematsu versus the United States. So Korematsu would bring a lawsuit about this imprisonment. And the Supreme Court would rule that's a wartime measure. It's fine. even though there was absolutely no proof. But the Roosevelt administration said, we had proof that Japanese Americans were doing this, but we can't tell you. And the Supreme Court took them as their word. Took them at their word. It's a military decision. And this should remind you of other military decisions down the road, but this is a dangerous step. In 1988, Congress would pass a law essentially apologizing for this deed and giving each descendant or living internees or direct descendants to $20,000 as reparations for what happened to them. President Reagan was opposed to this. This is part of the conservative revival, but Democrats controlled Congress and passed it, and he finally very reluctantly signed it. And $20,000? Now, $20,000 is about $40,000 today, but still, it seems pretty small, almost like a slap in the face. And I've seen a number of Japanese immigrants Japanese Americans who were in turn talk about this, and they saw it as a humiliation. Some didn't accept it. But $20,000 if you need it is still $20,000. So, the United States, we've got to get back to Europe. I have to skip a few things. But the Soviets began counterattacking after Stalingrad. In 1943, right here at the Battle of Kursk, the Germans did their last major attack. The biggest battle, if you take amount of equipment, planes, and tanks ever, the Battle of Kursk. And it was a decisive Soviet victory. And after that, the German army would be forced in a series of bloody but massive Soviet attacks to be pushed westward. So, for example, at the end of 1943, the Germans retook a lot of the Ukraine. 1944, in the biggest offensive in world history up to that time, Operation Bagration, they cleared out this area. And by end of 1944, they're sweeping into the Balkans and into Poland. And when the Soviets saw what the Germans had done to the areas they occupied, the ruin they had left and the people they had murdered, their desire for revenge would be even bigger. What the Soviets, or what the Germans did, I always look back and it's amazing that it's almost amazing. People have said that it's almost amazing any German survived after seeing what the Germans did in Soviet areas. The United States Army was tiny, had to rebuild, and of course the first troops kind of had to go to the Pacific. And so there weren't any American forces of any number until the end of 1942. And the British, of course, are going to be limited. And so the decision was made to attack French colonies controlled by Vichy France here in North Africa. British, Canadian, American forces. Most of the French forces did join. There was some fighting, though. The Germans sent down reinforcements. The first time American forces met German forces at a place called Kasserine Pass, the Americans were routed. The Americans had a lot to learn. But at the end of 1943, the Allies took North Africa. Into 1943, the decision was made, therefore, they're not ready to attack here. There's the front. This is the decisive front. Stalin has been pressuring the United States and Britain to open a second front. But they're not ready. They attacked Sicily, which is kind of on the periphery, an Italian island. After Sicily falls, after bloody fighting, add this: Mussolini's government collapsed. Mussolini collapsed. The Germans, though, would move down and occupy Italy, much of Italy. And that's when the final solution would begin in Italy. They'd be sent to Auschwitz, Birkenau. Then the British, Americans, French, Polish forces up. They attacked Italy. That turned out to be a bloody quagmire that would last 2 years. Italy's a narrow island with mountains, so even though the Germans were outnumbered 4-1, they just could hold out because they're under defense. And after Kursk, the Allies realized, we got to get a second front, but the Soviets might take the whole thing. Yeah.
In 1942, Devil's Brigade was sent to
43, yeah. Yeah. because Italy and the United States attacked in 43. But it showed that this was a kind of a pipe dream of Churchill, how all these commandos turned out to be pretty much ineffective. So they were just used basically as infantry. Very good infantry. And then they disbanded. A good friend of mine's father was in that unit. And he fought in Italy. And then, yeah, he was a fifth Allied soldier to enter Rome when the Germans left. Pretty interesting story. So, at Casablanca, which is in French Morocco, Churchill and Roosevelt met. They're actually going to meet with Stalin a month later in Tehran, which is today in Iran. And a couple things happened. First off, they found this out, we got to do the second front. The Soviets might get everything. They might take all of Germany. But Roosevelt also made the announcement that the United States and Britain will accept nothing but unconditional surrender from the Axis powers, which meant Japan and Germany. The reason they did this, knowing that means Germany might fight to the finish, but they did it for one very important reason. The Soviets. The United States and Britain were terrified that Stalin and the Soviets would sue for peace. Remember, they already had a non-aggression pact before Germany invaded. And we were terrified that Stalin might realize we've lost too much and sue for peace before the Americans and British got in. So we're telling the Soviets, we promise we will fight to the finish. Don't you quit. Please don't quit. Everyone got that? We're telling the Soviets not to quit. The problem is, we have now committed to a war or a surrender without any conditions to the Germans and the Japanese. Everyone got that? So we got to the Japanese. And that's a different kind of war. That's a different type of war. And let's say, why do people... But Japan wanted to sue for peace. And we're now committed to unconditional surrender. And Roosevelt is going to die in April of 1945. That means the next president has to deal with the legacy of unconditional surrender. Why the hell are you guys walking around? What class are you supposed to be in? Yeah. Suing for peace. Sue is another term for a legal exchange. And so a peace treaty is a legal document. So it just sticks. I know it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it's another term for a legal agreement or disagreement. Yeah.
Do we have an idea of what would happen if the Soviets did surrender?
No idea. Yeah. So, very quickly, last couple things. While this is going on, the United States and Britain carried out total war. They called it strategic bombing. The idea is to take out their long-range effort to fight. And so that included things like knocking out their industry, knocking out oil, but also terror bombing of civilians. The British bombed at night using bombers like these very good bombers called Lancaster because they lost so many planes in daylight. But that meant they couldn't hit anything, so they just would bomb civilian targets and kill civilian workers, knock out the factories by killing the workers. The Americans at first tried precision daylight bombing. They thought their planes would be better protected. That's a B-17 Flying Fortress. And they thought their planes were better. They had better technology in the British, and they could hit targets better. They couldn't. And in fact, it didn't work very well. The Allies would lose 46,000 aircrew killed and 3 times that number wounded. This was a bloody fight, and it mostly failed to stop industry. It destroyed cities. That's Berlin after the March bombing of 45. One night in Hamburg, 1943, British firebombed. and killed 45,000 civilians. Most of them burned alive or asphyxiated. That's more than died in the Blitz. One night. Dresden would be twice that number. But it didn't end the war. But what was important were American fighter planes. American fighter planes, like the most famous and best plane built, maybe the best plane ever built, the P-51 Mustang. It was American design with a British engine. It rang the bell. Okay, a little bit finished tomorrow, then we're going to drop the atomic bomb tomorrow. Beautiful plane. There's a guy in Montana has one. Every once in a while it comes buzzing over. Its engine has this kind of a sound, you can really tell. No! Thank you for doing that. If you ever seen the Mustangs, are beautiful. I like fighter planes, so I think they're beautiful. I like old fighter planes. I don't care too much about new planes. Oh, yeah, yeah, I can't talk about it as much as you guys did in class, but you guys did a great job. Did a really good job. Huh? Yeah. It's a great engine.
It's still like.
It was in the Spitfire.
It was in a bunch of things.
And it was in the that engine was in the Lancaster, that bomb rush. Good story, yeah, good. It's really cool. It has a very distinctive sound. Yeah.
So I really want the military when they would use the column under Orwell, if someone had actual soldiers and also shoot.
Oh, yeah, sure. Live fire.
So I also read that stopped happening though because a few soldiers would panic and jump off.
Yeah, that has happened. They still do it.
They still do live fire.
Yeah.
I thought they do blitz.
They do live fire. But they don't do it near as much, and the bullets are way over there. They used to be just right at the barbed wire level.
Yeah, I saw a unit representation of it. It was older than I can't do anything about it.
That did happen. And but live ammunition just sound. And there's a feeling.
It's simulation compared to what you actually have.
The blanks just don't have the same feel, and so they wanted them to feel it.
That way they wouldn't panic on it.
Which of course, they know they're shooting over the head, so it's
It's scary.
see ya.